Chapter 16 of the Romance of Early Exploration. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Ted Leinhardt. The Romance of Early Exploration by Archibald Williams. Exploration in North Mexico and California. Of the exploits of the gallant Cortez, the conqueror of Mexico, no detailed description will be included in this volume, as they belong to invasion rather than exploration. We may, however, briefly review some of the expeditions dispatched by the conqueror and his successors in search of new fields for the energy of the eager multitudes who were pouring into New Spain by every vessel that arrived from the Old World. In 1539, the star of Cortez was setting. His success had raised up many enemies in Spain and Mexico, and he saw that to maintain his reputation he must blaze the trail towards regions where perhaps prizes equal to that of the sacked capital might enrich his followers. He had, 6 years previously, himself crossed the Gulf of California, named then the Sea of Cortez, to the great peninsula beyond, with the purpose of founding there a colony of Spaniards and Negro slaves. The venture was frustrated by a succession of fearful tempests, which so battered the vessels that only after the greatest hardships and perils did the intrepid leader get back to land. Stories were already afloat of wonderful towns in the north, where silver and gold could be got in plenty. After their experiences in the Valley of Mexico, the Spaniards eagerly seized on any rumor and longed to put it to the test. Accordingly, in 1539, Cortez fitted out at Acapulco, a port on the Pacific coast, a small fleet of 3 ships, which he placed under the command of Francisco de Ulloa, with instructions to sail up the Sea of Cortez and spy out the countries washed by its waves. The fleet sailed on July 8th. For some days it passed along shores, quote, sweet and pleasant through the abundance of trees that grew thereon, and rivers which passed through these countries, for which we often thanked God the Creator of them all, end quote. Then the Pacific proved false to its name. A furious storm arose, and did such damage to the ships that they had to put into the little port of St. Iago for repairs. When these were completed, the voyagers proceeded, and presently noticed that the distance between Santa Cruz, Lower California, and the mainland seemed to diminish. Quote, whereupon we began to be of diverse opinions, some thinking that this coast of Santa Cruz was a firm land, and that it joined the continent of New Spain. Others thought the contrary, and that they were nothing else but islands, which were to westward. End quote. After continuing northwards for many leagues, the explorer, quote, found always more shallow water, and the sea black, thick, and very muddy, and came at length into 5 fathoms of water. And seeing this, we determined to pass over to the land which we had seen on the other side, and here likewise we found as little depth and less, whereupon we rode all night in 5 fathoms of water, and we perceived the sea to run with so great rage into the land that it was a thing to be marveled at, and with the like fury it returned back again with the ebb, during which time we found 11 fathoms of water, and the flood and ebb continued from 6 to 8 hours. Quote, the following day the captain and pilot went up to the ships, and saw all the land full of sand in a great round compass, and joining itself with the other shore, and it was so low that whereas we were a league from the same, we could not well discern it, and it seemed that there was an inlet of the mouths of certain lakes, whereby the sea went in and out. End quote. Ulloa had reached the head of the Gulf, and without knowing it, was at the mouth of the great Colorado River, which here flings its red waters into the salt waves. He had proved, however, that Santa Cruz was not an island, but a huge peninsula. A certain want of enterprise made him turn back before he had satisfied himself as to the cause for the great rush of water into the bay at the point of junction. But he had sufficient curiosity to land and investigate an island from which smoke and flame were seen to rise, and to trace them to, quote, certain mountains and breaches of burned earth, whereout ascended into the air certain cinders and ashes, which mounted up to the middle region of the air in such great quantity that we could not esteem less than 20 loads of wood to be burned for the causing of every one of those smokes, whereat we were not a little amazed. End quote. As the ships coasted down the peninsula, Indians of huge stature were observed and pursued, but without success. At last they came to the southernmost point of the peninsula, whence Ulloa explored the Pacific coast for some distance. In April he sent back a vessel with a record of his discoveries and continued his voyage. According to one account, he then disappeared altogether, whereas that of Hakluyt asserts that he returned to Acapulco, finding the winds very adverse and his provisions almost exhausted. In any case, the expedition had not discovered anything of immediate value. It was Cortes' last effort. He left the same year for Spain to demand redress for the conduct of Antonio de Mendoza, the new viceroy of New Spain, who had quarreled with him on the subject of dispatching exploring parties by sea or land. On his own authority, Mendoza had sent a small band of men under the friar Marco de Nica in 1539 to investigate the northern districts of Mexico. The company included a Negro called Stephen, who had lately returned from those regions, of which he gave so glowing an account as to induce the viceroy to dispatch the present expedition. San Miguel, in the province of Culiacan, was the starting point. From there the friar traveled northwards to Petetlan, being very hospitably received by the natives, who pressed food and flowers upon them. At Petetlan, one of his companions, the monk Honoritas, fell ill and had to be left behind. Continuing his way, the friar crossed an arid desert to the territory of some Indians, who told him of a country several days distant where there were great towns inhabited by a nation who had cotton clothes and vessels made of gold and silver, the more precious metal being also used for covering the walls of their temples. At a town called Vacupa, which he soon entered, Denica rested a few days and ordered some of his comrades to penetrate westwards to the Gulf and bring up natives from the coast for questioning about the country in that direction. Stephen, the Negro, was sent northwards in advance to see if by that way he might learn any news of any notable thing which we sought to discover. And I agreed with him, says Denica, that if he found any knowledge of any people and rich country which were of great importance, that he should go no further, but should return in person, or should send me certain Indians with that token which we were agreed upon, to wit, that if it were but a mean thing, he should send me a white cross of 1 handful long, and if it were any greater matter, one of 2 handfuls long. And if it were a country greater and better than New Spain, he should send me a great cross. Within 4 days there arrived from Stephen a cross as high as a man, and a message to the effect that 30 days' march ahead were 7 cities, rich in pearls and gold. This was corroborated by certain tattooed Indians who happened to come to Vacupa. The friar at once started off, and soon came on a cross set up by Stephen to show which way he had gone. Here I set up 2 crosses, and took possession according to my instructions, because the country seemed better unto me than that which I had passed. The natives kept speaking of Savola, or Cibola, one of the 7 cities of the north, as very rich, also of other cities, Marata and Acus. After crossing a second desert, he received news from Stephen to the effect that he had found all things as the Indians said. Denica traversed a 3rd desert with the kindly assistance of the Indians, who seemed to take a pleasure in forwarding his mission. All was going well when an Indian, one of Stephen's men, came up with tidings that Stephen had reached Cibola, but had been very badly treated and cast into prison without food or drink. The truth appears to be that Stephen was a great scoundrel and had outraged the natives by his behavior. Denica's bodyguard, on hearing this, began to show signs of panic, which the friar temporarily calmed by a judicious distribution of presents and the advice, quote, not to be afraid, but to go forward with me, end quote. When, however, the expedition met 2 wounded Indians who had been in the Stephen affair, all the natives but 2 at once refused to go any farther. Even this did not daunt their leader, who was determined at all risks to get a view of Cibola, and also, if possible, some news of his imprisoned comrade. So, with the faithful pair, he followed his way, quote, till I came within sight of Cibola, which is situate on a plain at the foot of a round hill, and maketh show to be a fair city, and is better seated than any that I have seen in these parts. The houses are builded in order, according as the Indians told me, all made of stone with diverse stories and flat roofs, as far as I could discern from a mountain, whither I had ascended to view the city. The people are somewhat white. They wear apparel and lie in beds. Their weapons are bows. They have emeralds and other jewels, although they esteem none as much as turquoises, wherewith they adorn the walls and the porches of their houses, and their apparel and vessels, and they use them instead of money through all the country. They use vessels of gold and silver, for they have no other metal, whereof there is greater use and more abundance than in Peru, end quote. The latter part of this passage is evidently founded on mere hearsay evidence, for Danica did not dare to enter the town, lest his death should prevent his discoveries being known to the viceroy. Therefore, after setting up the usual cross as a sign of possession, he turned southwards, and in due course reached San Miguel again. The news he brought back, whatever might be its real value, sufficed to prompt Coronado, the governor of New Galicia, to approach Mendoza on the subject of sending out a much larger expedition. The viceroy willingly fell in with the suggestion. He decided to dispatch a sea force and a land force to act in concert along the coast of the Gulf of California. Coronado himself commanded the foot detachment, and 2 vessels, the San Pedro and Santa Catalina, were assigned to Hernando de Alarcón. Coronado started from San Miguel in February 1540. Alarcón from Acapulco in May. The admiral took with him a 3rd ship laden with provisions for the land force, with which he was to keep in touch as much as possible. On their way up the Gulf, the ships were overtaken by a great storm, which so frightened the crew of the Santa Catalina that they cast overboard 9 pieces of ordnance, 2 anchors, and 1 cable to lighten the vessel. After making good these losses at St. Iago, Alarcón sailed to San Miguel, to find that Coronado had already started inland, expecting to meet him again at the head of the Gulf. He therefore lost no time in passing on to the mouth of the Colorado River, the exploration of which was one of his chief duties. On reaching the point where Aloha had turned back, he found the water so shallow that men had to be sent in advance in boats with the lead to make soundings. Meanwhile, the tide ebbed, leaving all 3 vessels stuck in quicksands, and the position had become one of great danger when the flow began, preceded by a bore, which gave our ship leave, as it were, to breathe a while. So the vessels all got afloat again. The crews had had such a fright that they wished to go back, but Alarcón insisted on fulfilling his mission, since the land force depended on the provisions carried by the fleet. Quote, and it pleased God that after this we came to the very bottom of the bay, where we found a very mighty river, which ran with so great fury of a stream that we could hardly sail against it. Alarcón decided to explore the river in 2 small rowboats, with a force of some 20 men, the rest of the expedition remaining at the river mouth. The strength of the current made it necessary to tow the boats. In one day they covered about 20 miles in this laborious fashion. The next they encountered a body of Indians, who made threatening signs, as if ordering the boats to return downstream. Alarcón thought it prudent to anchor in midstream, while through the medium of an interpreter he did his best to explain that his errand was one of peace. As the savages, whose numbers were rapidly increasing, did not appear to understand, he threw his sword and shield into the bottom of the boat and put his foot on them, as a sign that he did not mean to use them. At last he pacified them sufficiently to be able to venture ashore with sundry small presents, in return for which he received a few maize cakes. Some of the natives then made signs that he should let off his arquebus. The discharges so alarmed and angered the Indians that Alarcon re-embarked his men and would not land again for some time, although often invited to do so. Fortunately, he discovered that the natives worshipped the sun. He therefore went ashore and claimed to be the son of the sun, quote, "whereat they marveled, and then they began to behold me from the top to the toe, and showed me more favor than they did before. And from that time forward, of all the things they brought me, they flung up into the air one part unto the sun, and turned towards me to give me the other part." These simple-minded creatures also showed their reverence in a very practical manner by towing the boats, without which it would have been impossible to proceed. In return, they received small crosses made of sticks and paper, kissed by Alarcon to give them a value, until all material for the manufacture was exhausted. One of the Indians was an inquisitive fellow, and put the Spanish leader through a long catechism about his descent from the orb shining in the heavens. What puzzled him more than anything else was how Alarcon managed to get on the earth at all, to which the admiral replied that at sunset the sun touched the earth, and it was an easy matter to step off, and by this and other answers so completely satisfied his questioner that the Indians became almost pathetically friendly. Alarcon, in a homily which came rather strangely from one of Cortez's companions, gave them much good advice about maintaining peace with their neighbors. Near the point where the river Gila enters the Colorado, Alarcon found a man who described Cibola, the objective of Coronado's march, as being distant of 40 days' march along a path which followed the coast of the Gila. The description given by this man of Cibola tallied very closely with that given to Danica. A day or two later, he learnt through the same source of Stephen's death at Cibola, and on a subsequent occasion of the reason why he was killed, viz., to prevent him going back and acting as guide to the Spaniards. Meanwhile, Coronado had reached Cibola, and was as anxiously looking for news of Alarcon as Alarcon was diligently seeking tidings of him. One day, Alarcon noticed that the Indians were eagerly discussing some matter. He asked his interpreters to find out what it was, and learnt that native messengers had come from Cibola to the Indians of the valley, urging them to kill the strangers, as people like them had penetrated into their country and would probably march to the Colorado if they knew that the whites were in that part. The interpreters took Alarcon's part, urging that, while the invaders inland called themselves Christians, Alarcon was a son of the sun, and therefore could not be connected with them. Still the messengers persisted that all belonged to the same race, so Alarcon was asked point blank whether he also were a Christian. He pretended great surprise, though inwardly delighted by the news, at there being any other folk of his kind in the inland region, and succeeded in proving to his friend's satisfaction that Christian and son of the sun were synonymous terms, and that if indeed some of his brethren should be at Cibola, he hoped that they would receive as courteous treatment as had fallen to his lot. Alarcon's first impulse was to push overland to Cibola. He actually sent a man across country down to the ships to tell of his determination. But as he could not get a guide, he changed his mind, had the man overtaken and recalled, and sailed downstream to procure reinforcements. The journey, which had occupied 15 days against the current, took only 2.5 days with it. On arriving at his ships, he found that although the crews were very heavy from my long stay, everybody was in good health. He loaded up the 3 rowboats with articles of barter, seeds, and Castilian poultry, and after leaving orders that a chapel should be built to Our Lady of Good Guidance at the gulf's end, he ascended the stream to the place where he had turned back. The people there were very pleased to see him again, and would have had him stay with them. But Alarcon's loyalty to his commander forbade delay. He kept on up the river until he, quote, entered between very high mountains, through which this river passeth with a very straight channel, and the boats went up against the stream very hardly for want of men to draw the same, end quote. The Indians of these parts were evidently not so friendly as those lower down. In one place, an enchanter tried to prevent the passage by setting up sticks on each side of the river to cast a spell over the boats. Needless to say, with results very disappointing to him. At last, quote, seeing I could not attain to the knowledge of that which I sought for, I determined to turn back unto my ships, end quote. So he set up a very large cross, inscribed with words to show that he had got so far if any of Coronado's people should reach the river, and floated down to the ships again. He had, he tells us, ascended 85 leagues, or about 288 miles. Considering the nature of the swirling Colorado, one of the swiftest streams in the world, this was a feat of which he might well be proud. Reasons which we may suppose were quite sufficient prevented a third attempt to get into touch with Coronado, probably injury done to the fleet by that pest of tropical waters, the teredo, or wood-boring worm. While Alarcon was exploring the Colorado River, Coronado had been busy on land sending out expeditions in search of the ships. One, under Melchior Diaz, marched northwards to the Gila, which on account of the firebrands carried about by the natives to warm themselves with was named the Tizon, or Torch River. The people living on its banks were so strong that one of them could easily carry a log which 6 Spanish soldiers hardly managed to lift from the ground. Here Diaz got news of Alarcon and hurried down the Gila to its junction with the Colorado, only to find that the admiral had sailed down a few days before. But he discovered, buried at the foot of a cross, certain letters giving a description of the Gulf. Diaz then crossed the Gila and ascended the main stream in search of a fit place for crossing into the western country. After 6 days' travel, he reached what he considered to be a suitable spot and set about building a raft, aided by the people of the place, who apparently welcomed the strangers. While the building was in progress, a soldier noticed a body of natives cross the river and ascend a hill on the farther side in a manner which aroused his suspicions. On being told of this, Diaz seized a native and under torture extracted from him details of a plot for attacking the Spaniards when half of their number should have crossed the river. The commander, thus warned, disposed his men in a fashion which made the passage a safe business. The country on the farther side of the river was very barren and forbidding. Earthquakes occasionally alarmed the soldiers. The earth was strewn with the hot ashes wafted from some distant volcano. So after 4 days' journey into this inhospitable region, Diaz turned eastwards again for the main camp. His career was cut short by an accident of a rather extraordinary character. Seeing one of the camp dogs worrying some sheep which accompanied the expedition, Diaz galloped towards it and hurled his spear. The spear missed the dog and stuck in the earth at such an angle that the butt end penetrated the Spaniard's body, inflicting a mortal wound. Another night, Don Lopez de Cardenas was meanwhile exploring the district north of Cibola. On hearing of the great Colorado, he determined to investigate its nature. 20 days of travel across a very mountainous region brought the Spaniards to the edge of a mighty cleft, at the bottom of which the river ran. The ravine was probably the Grand Canyon, one of the most stupendous and magnificent sights that nature has to offer to the eye. The height of the cliffs made the stream, which at this point was of considerable breadth, appear like a little brook. 3 Spaniards, with the daring that characterized the invaders, tried to descend to the water's edge, but succeeded in getting only part of the way down. Cardenas describes the gorge as being at this point 9 to 12 miles wide at the top. He followed the canyon for some distance across the Colorado Plateau through a tract where wood, water, and grass could be got in abundance. But encountering a desert in which water was very scarce, he turned south again to Cibola. Mendoza's expedition did not have any results of the hoped-for kind. The Colorado and its eastern bank had indeed been partly explored, but the gold and silver, which had been the magnet of attraction, proved to be conspicuous by their absence. In a letter to the governor, Coronado says of De Nica's report, quote, "I can assure your honor he said the truth in nothing that he reported, saving only the names of the cities and great houses of stone. For although they be not wrought with turquoises, nor with lime, nor brick, yet are they very excellent houses of 3 or 4 or 5 lofts high, wherein are good lodgings and fair chambers. The 7 cities are 7 small towns, and they stand all within 4 leagues together, and none of them is called Cibola, but altogether they are called Cibola." End quote. On the whole, therefore, the outcome was disappointing. The Spaniards had not yet sufficient geological knowledge to tap the great silver deposits beneath their feet, which in after years brought fortune to many an adventurer better able to detect the presence of the precious metal. End of chapter 16. Chapter 17 of the Romance of Early Exploration. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Ted Leinhart. The Romance of Early Exploration by Archibald Williams. Chapter 17, Exploration of the St. Lawrence River. It was not to be expected that other nations would look on with folded hands while Portugal and Spain gathered a rich harvest from the lands reached by their daring mariners. In the 16th century, as now, money meant power, and the sovereign who could jingle a heavy purse could also command respect as a potentially formidable opponent in the sphere of politics. The success of the Portuguese had driven the Spaniards to send out Columbus and Magellan, and their discoveries in turn aroused the spirit of emulation among English and French. In 1497, John Cabot, a Venetian by birth, who had settled down at Bristol as a merchant, obtained permission from King Henry VII to sail for China across the Atlantic by a more northerly course than that of Columbus, in spite of a warning from Spain that such an expedition would be an unfriendly act, as the diplomatists say, towards Spain and Portugal, between whom the unknown world had practically been divided by the papal bull of 1494. In order not to cause complications, Cabot kept far north while crossing the Atlantic, and on June 24, 1497, struck the American coast in the latitude of Labrador and Newfoundland. The exact position of his landfall cannot be determined, but we know that he fancied that he had reached the territory of the Grand Cham. It is also doubtful whether his first sight of the New World anticipated Vespucci's landing in the Gulf of Mexico. At any rate, to Cabot is generally given the credit of having been the first European, the Vikings excepted, to strike the American continent. After exploring the coast for 900 miles without seeing any human beings, he set up British and Venetian flags and returned to Bristol, where great honor was paid him. "He dresses in silk," writes a contemporary, "and these English run after him like people possessed." And thrifty Henry gave him 10 pounds wherewith to celebrate his discovery. Next year, Cabot and his son Sebastian made a second voyage westwards. Their exploration of the American coast extended over about 1,000 miles, from Belle Isle to Cape Cod. Unfortunately, the accounts we have of both expeditions are so imperfect and confused that it is impossible to follow the track of the Venetians with any degree of certainty. But there is reason to believe that the Cabot's discoveries led Norman and British fishermen to the coast of Newfoundland and Labrador in search of cod a very few years later. They also undoubtedly caused the dispatch of their brothers Corte-Real from Portugal to investigate the northern coasts of the New World, after the accidental discovery of Brazil by Cabral in 1500, since the Cabots had shown that the land in those latitudes probably bulged far enough eastwards to fall within the Portuguese sphere of influence. Gaspar Corte-Real made 2 voyages in 1500 and 1501, probably round about Newfoundland, and was lost during the second. In 1502, his brother Miguel sailed in search of him with 3 small vessels, and, like Gaspar, he too was lost sight of. It is interesting to note that on his first voyage, Gaspar brought home some wild men, white bears, these suggest a visit to Greenland, and a number of silver ornaments of Venetian make, which the natives must have got from the Cabots. The general result of these explorations was to condemn a region where blustering winds made the sailor's life irksome and a sterile coast, clad for many weary months in snow and ice, offered the explorer but a scant inducement to land. So for the time, England and Portugal paid no further heed to these inclement regions, but turned their eyes to the more southerly routes. This gave France a chance. In 1508, 2 ships sailed from Dieppe, the one commanded by a Frenchman, Jean Aubert, the other by a Florentine, Giovanni da Verrazzano. They crossed the Atlantic, passed through the Straits of Belle Isle, and discovered the mighty St. Lawrence, as they named it in honor of the saint of the day, 10 August. They explored it for more than 80 leagues, finding the inhabitants very friendly, with whom they made some very profitable exchanges in peltries. The next year, the good people of Rouen were entertained by the sight of some Indians whom the explorers brought back with them, dark-colored men, thick-lipped and tattooed. In 1515, Louis XII was succeeded by Francis I. This monarch is credited with but little respect for the papal bulls of partition, which brought riches by the shipload into the treasury of his rival, the Emperor Charles V. Portugal and Spain are dividing up the New World between them, he is reported to have said one day, but I should like to see the clause in Adam's will which left them heirs to these vast possessions. His sailors scoured the seas, hunting for Spanish treasure ships. No captain was more active than Verrazzano, who had the good fortune to make a prize of the spoils sent home by Cortez in 1523 to his royal master, thus marking himself out for the command of an expedition which Francis sent westwards in 1524 to find a way to Cathay. The exploit of Magellan and the little Victoria had indeed revealed the Southwest Passage, but the distance round South America was so great that it served to turn people's attention to the possibility of discovering some more northerly opening through America. As explorations had already proved the coastline to be continuous from Magellan Straits to Chesapeake Bay, it was evident that the hitherto comparatively neglected northerly regions were now worthy of investigation. Verrazzano's expedition may therefore be called the first dispatched to seek the Northwest Passage, which, after 330 years of persistent effort, was finally discovered by Sir Robert McClure in 1854. Verrazzano's Dauphin probably first sighted land near Cape Fear in North Carolina, from which point he followed the coast up to an island which has been identified with Rhode Island. In a letter which he sent to the king on his return, he describes his voyage in detail, with many references to the people, trees, and fruit of the shores on which he landed. One of the most interesting passages is thus given by Hakluyt. We saw in this country, Virginia, many vines growing naturally, which, growing up, took hold of the trees as they do in Lombardy, which if by husbandmen they were dressed in good order, without all doubt they would yield excellent wines. We at once think of the Vinland discovered by the Vikings. Internal troubles checked French exploration from 1525 to 34. In the latter year, one Jacques Cartier, a native of St. Malo, well seen in the art and knowledge of navigation, and especially of the north parts, led by some hope to find passage that way to the South Seas, sailed from St. Malo in command of an expedition of 2 small ships of 60 tons burden each. Favoring winds carried him quickly to Cape Bonavista on the eastern shore of Newfoundland. His subsequent movements are rather hard to follow, but it is probable that he sailed northwest along the coast of Labrador for 150 miles and then returned to the Straits of Belle Isle, through which he passed into the Great Gulf of St. Lawrence. After spending some months exploring the coasts of this almost landlocked sea, he passed out of it the way he entered and sailed for France, arriving at St. Malo early in September 1524. He brought back with him 2 Indian boys, named Taig Nohagni and Domagaya, the sons of Indian chiefs. These boys played an important part in Cartier's second voyage, made in the following year. A storm scattered the 3 ships, and they did not meet again before all reached the rendezvous on the north coast of Newfoundland. They then followed the northern shore of the Gulf past the long island of Anticosti to the archipelago of the Mingin Islands. At this point, Cartier learned from his native boys that their tribe lived at Stadacona, the district of Quebec, and that they were well acquainted with the navigation of the river. Early in September, the fleet passed the island of Orleans and entered the splendid anchorage commanded by the frowning hills on which now stands Quebec. A little above this point, the St. Charles River enters the St. Lawrence on the left bank. Cartier ran his ships into the St. Charles to be out of the way of the masses of drift ice which the spring thaw would send down the main stream. The spot was encircled by swamps covered with a dense growth of dogwood, spruce, and cedar, except where here and there a patch of swampy meadow refused to nourish even brushwood. The swamp extended southward to the base of the rocky ridge, which he could see terminated in the high bluff on which Donnacana's, the chief of Stadacona, stockade was built. The same swampy ground stretched back some distance from the banks of both the St. Charles and the St. Lawrence in distressing monotony, but with the advantage of enabling him to see the approach of the Indians from almost every direction. To the north, the land was covered with a dense forest of pine and hardwood, as it rose with a gentle slope to the base of the Laurentine Range. The glorious autumn tints warned Cartier of the approach of the Canadian winter. Had he been acquainted with its tremendous severity, he would probably have turned back with his ships and deferred further exploration till the next spring. But his ignorance and the desire to accomplish further exploration in search of a possible passage into the Pacific caused him to tie up 2 ships for the winter and prepare the smallest, the Emerillon, for a trip up the St. Lawrence to Hochelaga at the head of the navigable waters. The Indians of Stadacona, on getting knowledge of his design, were much perturbed. The 2 lads who had been carried off to France had learnt enough about European civilization to recognize that the presence of whites in Canada might have disastrous results to races who could oppose only arrows and spears to the cannon and thundersticks of the invaders. After Cartier had anchored in the St. Charles, they went ashore in Donnacana's canoe, and we can in imagination see them at the palaver held on the bluff to discuss the question of aiding Cartier, passionately pronouncing against the whites. At any rate, after the council, the natives endeavored to dissuade the French skipper from attempting to reach Hochelaga. They began by saying that it would be impossible for the boys to accompany him as guides. Cartier replied that he could go without them. Next, they offered bribes in the shape of a girl and 2 boys. Cartier gave the Indians in return a few presents. As a last resort, they tried the terrors of religion. 2 of their number were disguised like devils wrapped in dogskins, white and black, their faces blackened like coal, and horns on their heads more than a yard long. These lurked in a canoe in a secluded corner till the tide began to ebb, and then floated past the vessels, standing up and declaiming in a loud voice. The Indians declared them to be messengers sent by Kudragni, the Supreme Being, to warn the whites of the terrible cold at Hochelaga, which would assuredly kill anyone who should venture thither. This grotesque stratagem only evoked the reply that Cartier had consulted his god, who had promised fine weather and a prosperous voyage. After that, the Indians refrained from any further attempts at dissuasion. On September 21st, 1525, Cartier started westwards on the Amarian. The scenery was glorious, and the Indians encountered were ready to exchange fish and other food for trinkets, so that the crew had a good commissariat. A week's sailing brought them to Lake St. Peter, out of which, owing to the lowness of the water, they could not discover a sufficiently deep channel even for their little ship. So Cartier left 10 men in charge, while with the rest of the company he pushed on in the ship's boat. 45 leagues beyond the lake they found Hochelaga, a stockaded village at the foot of a mountain commanding the river, to which Cartier gave the name of the Mont Regal, or Montreal. So magnificent was the view commanded from its sides. Cartier's enthusiasm over the grandeur of the place was somewhat damped by the discovery of foaming rapids just above Montreal, for they proved beyond doubt that the St. Lawrence was a river, and not a mere passage between two huge islands, as Cartier had long hoped might prove to be the case. The name of La Chine, by which these rapids are still known, is an interesting trace of the belief in the proximity of the Celestial Empire. The Indians of Hochelaga greeted the Frenchmen with all the fervor of a parent welcoming a child, says Cartier's narrative, for they recognized in these strangers, with their arquebuses and other metal weapons, a race who might be of great use for the reduction of hostile tribes. Their disappointment was proportionately great when, after a short stay, Cartier turned back to Orleans Island, which he reached on October 11. During his absence, the rear guard had built a fort and mounted in it the artillery from the ships, as a precaution against any attacks that the Indians might be tempted to make. On his return, Donnacona made overtures to Cartier for an alliance against certain of his neighbors to whom he owed a grudge, and when these were not responded to, he and his people treated the French with such coolness that the stockade was reinforced by a deep ditch. Winter now set in. The ships were soon frozen fast, and snow fell so thickly that it overtopped the stockade, so depriving the garrison of its main protection. The cold appeared terrible even to these hardy seamen, and to the miseries which they suffered from it there were soon added the horrors of scurvy. By the middle of February, only 10 out of a company of 210 remained untouched by the disease. 25 died, and the survivors were in such a condition that they could not possibly have repelled an attack. In order to conceal the helplessness of his people, Cartier would not let any Indians approach the ships or stockade, and so effectually prevented the entry of the things needed to cure the disease, a supply of fresh food. At last he learnt from Domagaya that a drink made from the leaves of a certain plant was a very efficient remedy. 2 native women were accordingly sent to hunt for the plant, probably balsam, of which they found a sufficient quantity to restore the sick men to health before the arrival of the spring. With March came a mitigation of the cold. The snow thawed, and the ice began to break up under the increasing power of the sun. But the gaps in the muster roll were so many that Cartier had to abandon one of his ships. Even more humiliating than this necessary step was the fact that he could show nothing in return for the money and time expended on the expedition. The results had been merely negative, proving that the St. Lawrence did not open a way to China, and that the country through which it flowed was for half the year icebound and inhospitable. To save his face, Cartier resorted to a regrettable expedient. He opened negotiations with Donnacona for the capture of an objectionable neighbor, asking in return for this service that the Indians should first attend a religious ceremony in the French quarters. At a feast following the ceremony, Donnacona, two other chiefs, the two boys Taig Noagni and Domagaya, and four others, including a girl, were seized and carried aboard the ships, where they were kept in close confinement till the date of sailing, May 6th. Cartier promised that he would bring them back the next spring, and he may have really meant to keep his word, though the intention, if it existed, does not excuse his action. His motive in taking these natives to France was probably the hope that they might reveal the locality of the treasures which rumor spoke of in the Saguenay region, and so make the voyage appear not unfruitful. The two vessels arrived at St. Malo on July 6, 1536, at a time very unfavorable for suggesting another expedition, as the coffers of Francis had been exhausted by war with Charles V. The poor savages, broken by homesickness, died, with the exception of the girl, before Cartier sailed for the third time in 1541. This expedition was made with the avowed purpose of founding a French colony on the banks of the St. Lawrence. The command devolved upon Sieur de Roberval as general of a land force made up largely of convicts, and upon Cartier as captain general and master pilot. By May 1541, Cartier had his 5 vessels ready and provisioned for 2 years, and sailed on the 23rd of the month. Roberval, being delayed by difficulties in collecting artillery and ammunition, did not start till a year later. So Cartier, after waiting in vain for him a month in the Straits of Belle Isle, set off up the river for his old haunts. When he reached Stadacona, the natives surrounded him with their canoes, eager to welcome their long-absent relatives. Great must have been their dismay when they learnt that Donnacona was dead, and that, as Cartier alleged falsely, the other 8 were so well pleased with their new home that they had preferred to remain there. But they dissembled any doubts that they may have had, and Donnacona's successor crowned Cartier with a chaplet of beads. Still, the captain general thought it advisable not to trust the folk whom he had wronged. About 10 miles above Stadacona was the settlement of a chief named Hochalai, who had been friendly to the explorers on the previous ascent. So to this spot Cartier took his ships. Having put his artillery and stores ashore, he built a fort, and cleared away more than an acre of forest for planting a crop of turnips to prevent a second attack of scurvy. While leveling the rock for the fort, the workers found quartz crystals, which they mistook for diamonds, and a shining substance, mica or iron pyrites, resembling gold ore in its appearance. 2 ships were now sent back to France, after being emptied of their contents, with dispatches concerning the progress of colonization. As soon as they had departed, Cartier manned a couple of boats and paid a second visit to the Lachine Rapids in hopes of being able to pass them and explore the river beyond. Failing to effect this, on account of the strength of the current, he left his boats below the rapids and took to the banks, but turned back after going a short distance through the thick forests. On his return to camp, he found that his former friend, Hochalai, had gone to Stadacona to arrange measures for a combined attack on the French. Whether Cartier found it impossible to maintain his position in the face of such hostility, we do not know. It is certain, however, that Roberval's fleet on its outward voyage in 1542 met Cartier's 3 vessels returning to France, and that Cartier refused to go back with the dilatory general. Roberval took his 3 ships to Cartier's fort, which he strengthened considerably and rendered more comfortable by the addition of several substantial houses, a bakery, a mill, and a well. Provisions being short, he then sent back 2 vessels to France, with orders to return with all necessaries in the spring. The winter brought the scurvy with it, and carried off 50 men. The garrison, mostly convicts, gave poor Roberval a great deal of trouble by their insubordination. Whippings and other punishments, of women as well as of men, were of daily occurrence. With the melting of the ice, the general prepared for exploration. 30 out of the 100 survivors were left to guard the fort. Of the doings of the 70, we have but scanty records. It is uncertain even what happened to the colony, though under such a commander we can only suppose its history ended disastrously. For 65 years, the exploits of Cartier remained unheeded. Stray adventurers traded with the natives of the Saguenay, but no national move towards the occupation of New France was made. Only when Champlain in 1608 founded the city of Quebec did the discoveries of the St. Malo captain, the first great French explorer, begin to bear fruit. End chapter 17.
Chapter 18 of The Romance of Early Exploration. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Romance of Early Exploration by Archibald Williams. The Search for a Northeast Passage to Cathay. Expansion of English trade. Difficulty in finding new markets drives her to seek a route to China. The merchant adventurers dispatch an expedition along the north of Russia under Sir Hugh Willoughby. Delay on east coast. A storm separates the vessels. Chancellor reaches the White Sea and proceeds to Moscow. Fate of Willoughby, who possibly first discovered Spitzbergen. Burroughs' voyage in 1556 to Kara Sea. Failure of Pett to explore further. The Dutch continue the task. Their first expedition. Second expedition stopped by ice at Nova Zembla. Third expedition, 1596. Reaches Spitzbergen and proceeds to Nova Zembla. Crew winter there. Intense cold. A house built. Narrow escape from suffocation. 12th night. The sun seen again. The survivors embark on 2 boats. Death of Barents and another. The rest reach Norway. Discovery in 1871-6 of relics of this expedition. The Northeast Passage first made in 1878-9. The growth of England in both population and enterprise during the reign of Henry VIII made it inevitable that she should enter into competition with the more favored nations, Spain and Portugal, who for the time had secured a monopoly of Eastern trade. Her manufactures were now of importance. She had goods to sell, but her markets were much restricted. In the introduction to an account of Sir Hugh Willoughby's expedition given by Clement Adams, we find these remarks. Those merchandises which strangers in the time and memory of our ancestors did earnestly seek and desire were now neglected, and the price thereof abated, although by us carried to their own ports, and all foreign merchandises in great account, and their prices wonderfully raised. So certain grave citizens of London, men of great wisdom and careful for the good of their country, began to think with themselves how this mischief might be remedied. Neither was a remedy, as it then appeared, wanting to their desires for the avoiding of so great an inconvenience, foreseeing that the wealth of the Spaniards and Portingales by the discovery and search of new trades and countries was marvelously increased, supposing the same to be a course and mean for them also to obtain the like. They therefore resolved upon a new and strange navigation. And whereas at the time one Sebastian Cabota, a man in those days very renowned, happened to be in London, they began first of all to deal and consult diligently with him, and after much speech and conference together, it was at last concluded that 3 ships should be prepared and furnished out for the search and discovery of the northern part of the world, to open a way and passage to our men for travel to new and unknown kingdoms. The merchant adventurers, as they were then called, therefore clubbed together their money and had 3 ships built of well-seasoned wood and sheathed below the water-line with lead to protect them against the ravages of the boring worm, of which such bad reports were brought back from tropical waters. Provisions for 18 months were placed on board, because it was doubtful whether there were any passage, yea or no, and it might be necessary for the ships to spend a winter among the ice. The expedition was placed under the command of Sir Hugh Willoughby, a brave, earnest, and powerful man who took the Bona Esperanza as his flagship. To the Edward Bonaventure the owners appointed Richard Chancellor, a man of great estimation for many good parts of wit in him. The 3rd vessel was named the Bona Confidentia, a title like the rest of good omen. On May 20th, 1553, the 3 ships weighed anchor at Ratcliffe, then a little port some distance below London on the Middlesex bank, and floated down with the ebb tide. At Greenwich, where the court lay, the sailors, attired in sky-blue clothes, manned the yards and fired several broadsides, to the great admiration of the courtiers and the crowd of other onlookers. Contrary winds drove the fleet into Harwich, where Chancellor discovered that part of the provisions had gone bad and that the wine casks were leaky. When at last the breezes blew favorably and sail was set, even the rough English mariners could not refrain from tears as the coasts of their native land sank below the horizon, considering into what hazards they were to fall and what uncertainties of the sea they were to make trial of. Their forebodings were soon justified. Off the coast of Norway a terrible storm overtook the fleet, separating the Edward Bonaventure from the other 2 vessels. Some little time before, Willoughby had arranged with his fellow captains that if a storm should scatter them, they should all make for Vardo, or Wardhouse, as he styled it, on the Lapland coast, where the first comer should wait for the others. Uncertainty about the fate of their companions greatly depressed Chancellor's crew, but obedient to orders, they sailed for Vardo and remained there a week, anxiously looking for the missing vessels. As none appeared, Chancellor decided to proceed alone, in spite of the attempts of some of his men to dissuade him from his purpose by graphic pictures of the perils to which such a course would expose them all. He kept on his way into latitudes where the sun was seen at midnight, which makes us suppose that he must have sailed north for a while and then turned south again. At length, it pleased God to bring them into a certain great bay, which was 100 miles or thereabout over, whereinto they entered, and somewhat far within it cast anchor. And looking every way about them, it happened that they espied afar off a certain fisher boat, which Master Chancellor, accompanied with a few of his men, went towards to communicate, with the fishermen that were in it, and to know of them what country it was, and what people, and of what manner of living they were. But they being amazed with the strange greatness of his ship, for in those parts before that time they had never seen the like, began presently to avoid and to flee. But he, still following them, at last overtook them, and being come to them, they, being in great fear, as men half dead, prostrated themselves before him, offering to kiss his feet. But he, according to his great and singular courtesy, looked pleasantly about them, comforting them by signs and gestures, refusing those duties and reverences of theirs, and taking them up in all loving sort from the ground. The great bay was the White Sea, and the fishermen Lapps. From them Chancellor learnt that he had landed on the coast of northern Russia. After victualling his ship, he sent a message to the Tsar asking permission to trade in his country, and presently received an invitation to the court at Moscow. Though delayed for some time by the procrastination of the local chiefs in supplying transport, he made the journey by sledge, being the first Englishman to reach Moscow. Of that town he gives a very long description, over which we must not linger here. He delivered a letter from Edward VI to the Tsar, and on his return carried back a reply to find the monarch dead and Queen Mary reigning in his stead. As further notice will be taken of Chancellor in the following chapter, we may now turn to the fortunes of the Bona Esperanza and her consort. These are very imperfectly known to us through some documents which were found in 1554 near the mouth of the river Vardzina in Lapland, together with the frozen bodies of Willoughby and the 2 crews. These documents contain a full list of the crews of all 3 vessels, the oaths to be taken by the crews to their captain and master, and a short logbook account of the voyage. Mention is made of the storm which separated the Bonaventure. After that misfortune, Willoughby ran for Vardo as agreed, but was carried north by the winds into latitude 72 degrees, where he sighted land. Whether this land was the southern end of Spitzbergen is very doubtful. It cannot be determined whether Willoughby or Barentz was the first to discover this large group of islands far to the north of Norway. From this land he sailed south until land was again sighted. Along this he coasted westwards about 50 miles to a fair bay, which may have been the mouth of the White Sea, where we went on land with our boat, which place was uninhabited, but yet it appeared unto us that people had been there, by crosses and other signs. Continuing the voyage, they reached 3 good harbors enclosed by rocks, one of which ran far into the land. Here he decided to winter. Wherefore we sent out 3 men south-southwest to search if they could find people, who went 3 days' journey but could find none. After that we sent other 3 westward 4 days' journey, which also returned without finding any people. Then we sent 3 men southeast 3 days' journey, who in like sort returned without finding of people or any similitude of habitation. These words close the narrative. A will found in Willoughby's ship shows that Sir Hugh and most of her company were still alive in January 1554. Of the gradual failure of provisions, of the inroads of diseases and death, of strenuous efforts on the part of the gallant commander to keep up the spirits of his men, and of the final extinction of all life, we have no record. But from descriptions which have come down from the dead under similar conditions, we may conjure up the grim picture of this, the first great tragedy in the history of Arctic exploration. News of the disaster was brought to the English agent at Moscow more than a year later. He sent and recovered the ships and the dead bodies and dispatched them to England. But as if misfortune were inseparable from even the corpses of the expedition, the ships sank on the way home with the dead and the living who were conveying them. In 1556, the merchant adventurers sent Stephen Burrow, formerly master of the Bonaventure under Chancellor, to make further explorations along the north coast of Russia. He passed between Nova Zembla and the mainland into the Kara Sea. 24 years later, the company fitted out 2 vessels which were placed under Arthur Pett and Charles Jackman. Pett reached the Kara Sea, but failed to make the mouth of the river Obi. Jackman's ship was lost. The disappointing results of this voyage caused the company to turn its attention to a northwest passage above America, of which we shall treat in a later chapter. The Dutch took up the task where the English laid it down. Their wars with Spain had so impoverished them that they were forced by sheer necessity into a course of exploration towards Cathay, now the goal of all the Western nations. They had kept a watchful eye on the doings of Pett and his predecessors, and had even previously to 1580 made some attempts to emulate them. In 1575, the first Netherlander arrived in the White Sea, and from that time onwards, the Dutch became powerful rivals to the English for the Russian trade. In 1593, a small syndicate of Dutch merchants at Amsterdam sent out William Barents with the Mercury to seek a passage to the north of Nova Zembla. The voyage was devoid of any striking incidents, but Barents managed to survey the whole of the west coast of Nova Zembla before an impenetrable ice pack compelled him to turn homewards. The next year, a large expedition of 7 vessels left the Texel to extend the discoveries of Barents, who was captain of one of the ships. All the vessels were very well equipped in all respects, since their owners had gained certain privileges in respect of all trade that should be opened between the north of Russia and Asia. On August 19th, they came to the Vygots Straits between the island of Vygots, itself between the south of Nova Zembla and Russia, and the mainland, which they found to be completely blocked by ice. 2 days later, Barents' men landed on the island, where they found a boat from the Pechora River. From its crew they gathered some information about the sea to the east of Nova Zembla. Landing again, a week afterwards, they came across a party of Samoyeds, dressed in skins from head to foot. These they much astonished by a display of firearms. The 6th of September was marked by an encounter with a great polar bear, which killed 2 of the men, though their fellows were armed with pikes and matchlocks. In the end they secured the animal and skinned it. The 2nd voyage was a failure, though the vessels all returned safely. Yet, as Barents persisted that a passage might be found to the north of Nova Zembla, a 3rd expedition of 2 vessels was fitted out in 1596. Of these, Jacob von Heemskerk took command, Jan Rijp being captain of the other ship. On Barents, who shipped with Heemskerk, devolved the duties of chief pilot. Both Rijp and Barents thought it advisable to sail very wide of Nova Zembla, hoping that by doing so they might escape the pack ice. They therefore steered very nearly due north, too much north, Barents thought, and in latitude 74 degrees 30 minutes came upon a steep island, which from the incident of killing a bear there they named Bear Island. Still sailing north from this they again saw land in latitude 79 degrees 49 minutes, which at first was thought to be part of Greenland, but proved on investigation to be a group of islands which we now know as Spitzbergen. After circumnavigating this, they stood south towards Bear Island. When they had nearly reached it, a dispute between Rijp and Barents as to the proper course to follow ended in Rijp returning northwards and Barents continuing towards the south. Of Rijp we need take no more notice, as he effected nothing in the way of discovery after separating. The Captain General's vessel kept a southwesterly course until it reached the inhospitable shores of Nova Zembla, which it followed round the northeastern corner. At a point called Ice Haven, the ship was enclosed by ice, and raised up by it in a way which was most fearful both to see and hear, and made all the hair of our heads to rise upright. It now became evident that the crew would have to winter here, being, as it were, caught in a trap. They decided to quit the ship and build a house upon the land, a task in which they were providentially assisted by the discovery of a number of trees that had drifted upon the shore. The intense cold and the attacks of famished bears considerably delayed operations. If anyone put a nail in his mouth to hold it while doing work, it froze to the lips. The beer in the casks was frozen solid. Wind and snowstorms rendered the mere act of breathing very difficult. At last the house was finished and the roof piled over with seaweed to make it draught-proof. Even inside this shelter the temperature was so low that when they washed their sheets they could not dry them, since the side that lay next to the fire thawed, but the other side was hard frozen. All round the inside of the house were bunks, but even these had an inch of ice all over them. In rough weather the wood smoke made the interior almost uninhabitable, yet they did not dare either to go outside or dispense with the heat. At last, hoping for relief, they burnt part of their slender stock of coal, and to keep in the heat which it gave, without causing much smoke, they stopped up the chimney and doors. While they lay in their bunks, well comforted with the heat, some were attacked by giddiness and a sensation of stifling, owing to the formation of carbonic acid gas. so that some of us that were strongest started out of their cabins, and first opened the chimney and then the doors, when we all recovered our healths again by reason of the cold air, and so the cold, which before had been so great an enemy unto us, was then the only relief that we had. Science was not then sufficiently advanced for them to understand that impure, not heated air was the cause of their distress. Otherwise, without doubt, we had died in a sudden swoon. The poor prisoners continued to suffer terribly from cold, which, as Garrett de Vere, a member of the crew who wrote an account of Barent's voyages, quaintly says, began to strengthen as the days began to lengthen. On New Year's Eve it was so extreme cold that the fire almost cast no heat, for as we put our feet to the fire we burnt our hose before we could feel the heat, so that we had work enough to do to patch our hose, and, which is more, if we had not sooner smelt than felt them, we should have burnt them away ere we had known it. In spite of all this hardship, the men kept their discipline and spirits. When 12th night came, they made merry on a banquet of oil and flour pancakes, and a white biscuit each, and a drop of wine all round, which comforted us as well as if we had made a great banquet in our own house. The frugal feast over, they drew lots for the personation of imaginary characters, the gunner becoming king of Nova Zembla. Great was the general rejoicing when, on 24th of January, the sun, which had been invisible for nearly 3 months, showed one edge of its great red disk above the horizon. Sorely had they wished to see the greatest comfort that God sendeth unto man here upon the earth, and that rejoiceth every living thing. Half frozen, diseased, hunger-pinched as they were, their hopes revived now that the long night had passed. Curiously enough, according to their reckoning, the sun was 14 days under due, and some began to doubt whether it was the sun they had seen. The next 2 days were cloudy, so that it was impossible to check the correctness of their observation, but on the 27th the sun rose in his full roundness a little above the horizon. The same day they buried one of their comrades, so that their joy was tempered by sorrow. Towards the end of February, the whole party began to feel the effects of their long privations. Their strength failed until they could hardly bring in the wood for the fire, which alone kept them from dying of cold, and they feared that the time was not far off when they would have to relinquish their struggle with the elements. The ship had been too much knocked about by the ice to be of any use except to supply materials for patching up the 2 boats on which depended their only chance of escaping from the island. On June 12th, they hacked a path for the boats from the house to the water's edge through the ice hummocks, and the next day had them afloat. When they had put aboard such provisions and clothes as they could muster, and Barents had hung up in the hut a letter setting forth their experiences, they sailed away. Their sufferings among the ice floes were very great. Before they had gone far, Barents, whose strength had been failing, died, and at the same time another of the crew, Klaus Adrianson. The loss of their pilot was indeed grievous, since on him they depended for guidance towards the Lapland coast. After a series of adventures which nearly cost them their lives, they fell in on July 28th with 2 Russian ships. and we were much comforted to see the Russians, for that in 13 months' time we had not seen any man, but only monstrous and cruel wild bears. As they coasted along the north of Russia, they encountered other vessels, which helped them on their way, till on September 1st they entered the Kula River and there found Jan Ripe, from whom they had separated the year before at Bear Island. Their troubles were then over. 5 of the 17 that originally composed the crew were dead. The 11 survivors had in 2 small open boats crossed 1,600 miles of stormy waters made doubly dangerous by ice floes, living on such food as they might chance upon in the shape of eggs and foxes, without compass to guide them or instruments to gauge their position. How nearly they all came to sharing the fate of Willoughby cannot be calculated, but one cannot read Garrett de Vere's account, which is extremely interesting from beginning to end, of their winter in Nova Zembla, without wondering how they survived so many hardships and perils. In 1871, the ice harbor of Barents was again visited, after a lapse of 275 years, by Captain Ellen Carlson. Under a thick layer of ice he found the ruins of the house built by the Dutch explorers, and also a number of articles, which included a clock, mentioned in de Vere's narrative, copper and iron utensils, tools, compasses, shoes, arms, powder horns, still full of powder, candlesticks, knives, books, and engravings. These interesting relics were bought by an English tourist who sold them to the Netherlands government. 5 years later, an Englishman, Mr. Charles Gardner, took his steam yacht to Nova Zembla in hopes of discovering some further traces of Barents' sojourn there. Diligent search among the debris brought to light more than 100 objects of interest: a wooden stamp with seal, a leaden inkstand, 2 quill pens, a pair of compasses, wax candles, books, the ship's flag, and, most valuable of all, a powder horn containing Barents' parting letter, much decayed but still legible, which establishes the identity of the relics beyond all doubt. Mr. Gardner presented these to the Dutch nation. The Northeast Passage was not made till 1879, when Baron A. E. Nordenskjold in the Vega, after being compelled to winter somewhat to the west of Bering Straits, sailed out into the Pacific Ocean. End of Chapter 18.
Chapter 19 of the Romance of Early Exploration. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Rita Boutros. The Romance of Early Exploration by Archibald Williams. Chapter 19. The Travels of Mr. Anthony Jenkinson in Russia and Persia. To Richard Chancellor belongs the credit of founding the commerce between England and Russia, which soon attained such great importance. Very shortly after his return to England, Queen Mary, being desirous of promoting trading relations with Russia, granted a charter, 1555, to the merchant adventurers, which subsequently became known as the Muscovy or Russia Company, securing to them all rights and privileges which they had acquired or might acquire in the future by their discoveries. The same year the new company sent Chancellor to Moscow to negotiate with the Tsar's ministers for favorable terms of trading, and through him were fortunate enough to secure a monopoly of trade in the White Sea, with the right of establishing factories or depots at Kolmogorey, Vologda, and elsewhere. For the return voyage, Chancellor took on his ship Osip Nepier, the first Russian ambassador to the English court, with his suite and merchandise to the value of £100,000 in modern money. Disaster overtook the fleet. 2 of the 3 vessels were lost at sea, and the third, that of Chancellor, was wrecked on the coast of Aberdeenshire, with the loss of the gallant captain and most of the crew. The ambassador was one of the few survivors. The rough natives of the district treated him very badly, being wreckers by trade, but on his status being known, due honor was done him in the shape of escort and entertainment. About this time, says Holingshed's Chronicle, came to London an ambassador to the Queen from the Emperor of Cathay, Muscovia, and Rusland, who was honorably received at Tottenham by the merchants of London, having trade in those countries, riding in velvet coats and chains of gold, who bare all his costs and charges from the time of his entry into England out of Scotland, for thither by tempest of weather he was driven, and there forced to land. The Lord Montacute, with the Queen's pensioners, met him at Islington Town's End, and at Smithfield Bars the Lord Mayor and Aldermen in scarlet received him, and conveyed him through the city unto Maester Dimick's house in Fenchurch Street, where he lodged until the 12th of May, at which time he wanted no resort. And after his embassage done to the Queen, he departed again with very fair ships from Gravesend unto his country, after he had remained here 2 months and more. The commander of the expedition which took him back to Russia was one Anthony Jenkinson, a man who had traveled widely in the East and elsewhere, and by his acquaintance with the manners and customs of foreign countries, as well as by his skill in navigation, was well fitted for so important a position. Entrusted with the company's full instructions as to his duties, a cargo of merchandise, and a letter from Queen Mary to Ivan IV, he sailed on May 12, 1557, from the Thames as admiral to a fleet of 4 ships. The voyage up the east coast of England was much hampered by contrary winds, and not till June 27th did the vessels reach the Lofoden Islands. The strong currents running between these islands gave rise to stories of a terrible whirlpool, the Maelstrom, of which Jenkinson writes, "From half ebb until half flood it maketh such a terrible noise that it shaketh the rings in the doors of the inhabitants' houses of the said islands, 10 miles off. Also if there cometh any whales within the current of the same, they make pitiful cry. Moreover, if great trees be carried into it by force of streams, and after with the ebb be cast out again, the ends and boughs of them have been so beaten that they are like the stalks of hemp that is bruised." The currents are indeed dangerous, and Jenkinson only repeats the popular belief of the time. Much more recently, that imaginative writer, Edgar Allan Poe, has made the Maelstrom the subject of one of his most sensational tales. On July 2nd they passed the North Cape, to which Jenkinson, with wonderful accuracy, assigns a latitude of 71 degrees 10 seconds. Next they came to Vardo, a fortified island off Lapland, and on the 6th were off the mouth of the Varzina, where Willoughby and his crew perished. Here Jenkinson first saw the Lapps, half Gentiles as he calls them, and with their skins apparelled in such strange fashion that there is nothing seen of them bare but their eyes. On the 12th the vessels entered the roads of St. Nicholas, where they discharged their cargoes, and took on board a stock of furs and other merchandise. They then sailed for England, leaving Jenkinson, the ambassador, and several companions to pursue their journey southwards. A little boat carried the party up the northern Dwina to Vologda, where the captain specially noticed the log houses and the 2 churches in each parish, one for winter and one for summer use. From Vologda to Moscow sledges had to be used. His arrival at the old capital is dated December 6, 1561. On Christmas Day he was introduced to the Tsar, who sat aloft in a goodly chair of estate, having on his head a crown most richly decked, and a staff of gold in his hand, all apparelled with gold, and garnished with precious stones." The same evening he dined in the royal hall at 6 o'clock by candlelight. The magnificence of the entertainment much impressed him. "At the uppermost part of the hall sat the emperor himself, and at his table sat his brother, his uncle's son, the metropolitan, the young emperor of Kasan, and divers of his noble men, all of one side. There were divers ambassadors and other strangers, as well Christians as heathens, diversely apparelled, to the number of 600 men, which dined in the hall. I was set at a little table, having no strangers with me, directly before the emperor's face. Being thus set and placed, the emperor sent me divers bowls of wine and mead, and many dishes of meat from his own hand, which were brought me by a duke. And my tables served all in gold and silver, and so likewise on other tables there were set bowls of gold, set with stone, worth by estimation 400 pounds sterling, 1 cup, besides the plate which served the tables." During a stay of 4 months, Jenkinson saw all the lions of the place, including the wonderful Kremlin, and made notes on the dress and habits of the large population of the capital, which at the time of his visit boasted about 100,000 inhabitants. The Tsar, Ivan IV., though he received the Englishmen kindly, was fitly called the Terrible. During the first 25 years of his reign, he had extended the empire in all directions, reformed its internal administration, and established a standing army. The death of his first wife, like Henry VIII., he married 6 times, in 1558 altered his nature. From statesmanship he turned to debauch and cruelty, which deluged the country with the blood of his most eminent and faithful servants. At the time of his death, in 1584, nearly all his earlier conquests had been nullified, and the only really satisfactory remnant of his foreign policy was his alliance with England's queen, to whom he made more than one offer of marriage. On April 23, 1558, Jenkinson left Moscow for Persia, armed with letters from the Tsar to sundry kings and princes by whose dominion I should pass. He was accompanied by 2 Englishmen, Richard and Robert Johnson, and a Tartar interpreter. Traveling on a boat down the Volga, they came to Nijni Novgorod, the great trading center of Russia, where they joined a flotilla of 500 barges bound for Astrakhan. Kazan, the next important stopping place, is described as a fair town, after the Rus or Tartar fashion, with a strong castle situated upon a high hill, and walled about with timber and earth. This stronghold had been captured by Ivan a few years before, and was then undergoing considerable alterations. In mid-July, Astrakhan was reached. Of this important Caspian port, Jenkinson gives but a sorry account. The air is there most infected, by reason of much fish, and especially sturgeon, by which only the inhabitants live, having great scarcity of flesh and bread. They hang up their fish in their streets and houses to dry for their provision, which causeth such abundance of flies to increase there, as the like was never seen in any land, but to their great plague. A terrible famine and pestilence had filled the streets with starving people and piles of corpses, very pitiful to behold. The Tartars of the neighborhood flocked in to offer their children in exchange for bread, so that a sixpenny loaf would purchase a boy or girl. At Astrakhan the Tsar's authority ended, and during his further travels Jenkinson had to rely entirely on his own resources. Having joined certain Tartars and Persians in hiring a boat, the party embarked and sailed down to the delta of the Volga, where it discharged itself into the Caspian through 70 mouths. These three were the first Englishmen to enter this inland sea. Jenkinson, with characteristic thoroughness, at once began to survey the coasts and take soundings, with an eye to rendering navigation more certain for the company's merchants in the future. His observations were confined, however, to the northern parts of the western shores. After being tossed about by storms, the boat came to the mouth of the Ural River, where it was boarded by 30 pirates, who were anxious to get hold of the Kafirs, or Christian infidels, whom they believed to be there. The Tartar interpreter managed to persuade the invaders that there were no such objectionable persons about, and so the 3 Englishmen escaped. A landing was finally made at Cape Carrigan, the extremity of the great peninsula, projecting into the Caspian near the northeast corner. The people of the neighborhood were very bad and brutish, stealing, pestering, and driving very hard bargains for the food and transport animals of which the traders had need. At last matters were arranged for the hire of 1,000 camels. The caravan took an east-southeasterly direction to the territory of a Tartar chief, from whom Jenkinson obtained a passport in exchange for goods to the value of 15 rubles. A great desert had now to be crossed. The expedition suffered severely from want of provisions and water, until on the 20th day they reached what Jenkinson thought to be a gulf of the Caspian, but was in reality the isolated lake of Sarikamish. After recruiting on its banks, they proceeded to Urgenj, an important town on the old bed of the Oxus, which led the river into the Caspian Sea. In 1575 the Oxus took a new course and flowed north into the Sea of Aral. Our traveler has a good deal to say of the Tartar inhabitants, an ignorant, uncultured race, whose chief delights were war and hawking. "The hawks," he writes, "are lured to seize upon the beasts' necks or heads, which with chasing of themselves and sore beating of the hawks are tired. Then the hunter following his game doth slay the wild horse with his arrow and sword." The Kirghiz of Turkestan still train golden eagles to seize their prey in the manner described. Between Urgenj and Bokhara, a determined attack was made on the caravan by some desert robbers. On the 10th day out, the merchants captured 4 suspicious-looking riders, who, under pressure, confessed that they were part of a large band laid in ambush some distance further on. Jenkinson at once asked the Sultan of Urgenj for an escort of 50 men, which was granted. The escort rode on ahead, scouting, and presently came galloping back with the news that they had got into touch with the enemy, but would not stay with the caravan unless well paid for doing so. As their demands were not complied with, they galloped off, leaving the merchants, some 40 in number, to do the best they could for themselves. There were in camp a few Mohammedan Tartars, called holy men because they had been to Mecca. These asked to be allowed to find out by divination whether the caravan would be attacked. The ceremony was as follows. They took certain sheep and killed them, and took the blade bones of the same, and first sawed them and then burnt them, and took the blood of the said sheep, and mingled it with the powder of the said bones, and wrote certain characters with the blood, using many other ceremonies and words, and by the same divined, and found that we should meet with enemies and thieves, to our great trouble, but should overcome them, to which sorcery, adds Jenkinson, I and my company gave no credit, but we found it true. Hardly were the escort out of sight, when a band of mounted men, well armed with bows, arrows, and swords, came up, and demanded the surrender of the caravan. We defied them, wherewith they shot at us all at once, and we at them very hotly, and so continued our fight from morning until 2 hours within night, divers men, horses, and camels being wounded and slain on both parts. And had it not been for 4 hand guns, which I and my company had and used, we had been overcome and destroyed, for the thieves were better armed, and were also better archers than we. But after we had slain divers of their men and horses with our guns, they durst not approach so nigh, which caused them to come to a truce with us until the next morning, which we accepted, and encamped ourselves upon a hill, and made the fashion of a castle, walling it about with packs of wares, and laid our horses and camels within the same, to save them from the shot of arrows. And the thieves also encamped within an arrow shot also of us, but they were betwixt us and the water, which was to our great discomfort, because neither we nor our camels had drunk in 2 days before. During the night the robber chief sent a messenger, demanding the surrender of any Christians, to whom the caravan bashaw replied that there were no infidels in the train. And, as if to salve his conscience, he added that if there had been, he would rather have died than delivered them. The robbers caught one of the company, and put him to the torture to find out if this were so. But the men pluckily refused to give evidence prejudicial to the English merchants. The next day, sooner than renew the fight, the caravan owners paid bakshish in goods, and gave the robbers a camel to carry it away on. On December 23rd Bokhara was reached, the chief town of the Khanate of that name. According to Jenkinson, it was at that time divided into 3 parts, 2 for the Khan and 1 for the merchants. There is little doubt that it was then a city of great magnificence, for Khan Tahmasp had recently been restoring the damage done by Kirghiz invasions. There are many houses, temples, and monuments of stone, sumptuously builded and gilt. Jenkinson notes that the inhabitants were much troubled by a worm an ell long, which grew in the leg under the skin, and had to be extracted by very gradually rolling it out an inch a day. He ascribes its presence to the bad river water which the inhabitants drank. We can easily recognize in his description the guinea worm so well known to African travelers. Bokhara was a great center of trade for all Southwest Asia, India, and Russia. Muslins, cloth, silk, hides, wool, musk, rhubarb, damask, and satin were staple articles of barter. Jenkinson found, however, that his stock of kerseys did not sell well. For this reason, and because the whole country was in a very disturbed state, he decided not to extend his journey beyond Bokhara. In the spring he therefore turned homewards, March 15, 1559, a few days before a Khan of Samarkand invested the city. The journey back to Moscow was not attended by any notable adventures, except for a storm on the Caspian, which nearly cost the party their lives. At one time their fate hung in the balance, for the boat ran aground on a sandbank, and would have been battered to pieces had the storm continued but a very few hours longer. On September 2nd, Jenkinson reached Moscow with half a dozen ambassadors to the Tsar, who had been put in his charge by the Khans of Bokhara, Balkh, and Urgenj. The Tsar again treated him with courtesy, asking him to dinner. In the early summer he was back in London. a Tartar girl, my wench Ora Sultana, whom he had bought at Astrakhan, he gave to Queen Elizabeth. His work had been so well done that in 1561 the Muscovy Company decided to send him out again. Elizabeth entrusted him with further letters to the Tsar, and also with one to the great Sofi or Shah of Persia. The last appealed for a fair treatment of "our right well-beloved servant Anthony Jenkinson." It was written in English, Latin, Italian, and Hebrew. "We do hope," says the royal writer, "that the Almighty God will bring it to pass, that of these small beginnings greater moments and things shall hereafter spring both to the furniture of honors, and also to the great commodities and use of our peoples. So it will be known that neither the earth, the seas, nor the heavens have so much force to separate us, as the godly disposition of natural humanity and natural benevolence have to join us strongly together." The company gave Jenkinson the following instructions: that he should first go by his former route to Moscow and deliver the Queen's letter, and ask the Tsar for passports through his dominions. He should then proceed to Persia, or if he found that impossible in 1562, spend his time exploring round Nova Zembla for a northeast passage to Cathay. If a journey to Persia seemed altogether out of the question, he might either try to sell all his goods in Russia, or take them to Constantinople in search of a market. On August 20th, 1561, Jenkinson was in Moscow again. The Tsar had recently married a Circassian lady, and during what we should now call the honeymoon, would not allow anyone to come near him. When at last he did consent to receive ambassadors, Jenkinson had some trouble with the Secretary of State, who apparently wished to have a private look at Elizabeth's letters before they reached his royal master. On the captain refusing to hand them over to anyone except the Tsar, the secretary informed him that he could not be admitted to the court. The Tsar nevertheless granted him an audience, at which he delivered the letters, and asked permission to travel through his dominions to Persia. The answer, given apparently through the secretary, refused the permission. In dismay at such unexpected behavior on the part of his former patron, Jenkinson thought it best to go home forthwith. While he was making preparations for departure, he received a visit from Osip Napier, the ambassador whom he had brought to Moscow on his first trip. Napier told him that the Tsar was in reality willing to let him travel as before, and would also give him letters of recommendation to foreign princes. Armed with these documents, he left Moscow at the end of April 1562, in the company of a Persian ambassador, and reached Astrakhan early in June. Here they separated, the Persian crossing the Caspian in advance. To protect his boat from pirates, Jenkinson had 2 brigantines and 50 gunners placed at his service. These escorted him as far as Derbent on the west coast, the voyage being marked by one of the gales to which this inland sea is so liable. Derbent was the eastern terminus of the Great Wall built by Alexander the Great, which extended inland into the Caucasus, how far is not certain, and was at that time already fallen into decay. From Derbent they coasted along to Chabran, 80 miles south, where the goods were disembarked and placed under guard in a tent, that they might be safe from the bandits of the neighborhood. At the invitation of the King of Shirvan, Jenkinson repaired to his summer resort, 20 miles from Shimaka, and was well entertained in a pavilion nearly 100 feet long, in the center of which a fountain played. The king's dress included a turban of cloth of gold, wrapped about with 20 yards of the finest silk, and 2 earrings set with rubies of great value. 290 different dishes were set before the guests. The dinner over, Abdallah Khan questioned Jenkinson about his mission, promised an escort as far as Casbin, where the Shah then resided, and dismissed him with other signs of favor. On November 2, 1562, Jenkinson reached the Shah's court and was welcomed by Shah Ali Mirza, son of Abdallah. Unfortunately for his business, the Shah had recently made a treaty with the Turks, and as the Turks were bitterly hostile to all Christians, the Shah treated the bringer of letters from Elizabeth with great coldness, lest cause of offense should be given to his new allies. The interview terminated by the Shah saying, "O thou unbeliever, we have no need to have friendship with the unbelievers." From time to time, Persian officials tried, by questioning, to find out whether Jenkinson were a spy sent by the Portuguese, with whom they were meditating war, but his answers convinced them that he was not, so that after a 5 months' stay he was allowed to depart unmolested, with a rich garment of cloth of gold as a sign of the Shah's goodwill. He returned to Astrachan through the country of Abdallah Khan, who granted him and the company he represented trading privileges in his dominions, and attached to his person an ambassador to the Czar. At Shimaka he received a message from the King of Georgia, begging for assistance from his two powerful neighbors of Persia and Turkey. Jenkinson dispatched a companion, Edward Clark, to open communication with him. He was stopped on the frontier and compelled to return. Embarking at Chabran, the expedition reached Astrachan without mishap. There they found an escort of 100 gunners, who conducted them to Moscow, which they entered August 20th, 1563. All his merchandise had come safely through from Persia. He delivered to the Czar certain presents from the Shah, and in return for duties well performed, received a charter conferring ampler privileges on the company. Having made preparations for a fresh expedition to Persia, under the charge of 3 Englishmen, he left Moscow in June 1564, and at the end of September arrived safely in London. Of the further journeys made by Jenkinson there is no need to speak, as the first 2 were far the most important. Apart from the influence they had in opening a new channel for English commerce, they greatly extended geographical knowledge. Jenkinson was the first English writer to describe the eastern ports of Russia from personal observation. He first descended the Volga, since it had become a Russian river. He was the first Englishman to navigate the Caspian, and recognize that it was a landlocked sea, and had no communication with the Indian Ocean. He made mistakes, indeed, such as an explorer in those days could hardly avoid, yet he bridges over the lapse of years between the travels of Rubruquy and Marco Polo in the 13th century, and those of English and Russians in the 18th century, a long period of uncertainty and vagueness in the accounts of Central Asia. In 1602 appeared a work entitled Albion's England by William Warner, a rhyming story of exploration. A considerable part of it is given to the exploits of Jenkinson, whose contemporary reputation may be estimated from the following lines. Yet longer, for not largelier one yields matter, let us dwell of Jenkinson. But where shall we begin his lauds to tell? In Europe, Asia, Afrique. For these all he saw, in all employed for England's common good. Nor my rejoicings small, that from Elizabeth to reign, and I to live begun, hath happened that commerce and fame he to his natives won. End of chapter 19.
Chapter 20 of the Romance of Early Exploration. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Ted Leinhart. The Romance of Early Exploration by Archibald Williams. Attempts to find a northwest passage past America to the east. After the failure of Cartier to discover a way through the American continent to Asia, no more attempts were made in that direction for 40 years, when, owing to their ill success on the north coast of Russia, the English turned their attention to the polar regions lying above Labrador. In 1574, one of England's bravest sailors, Sir Martin Frobisher, who for many years had tried to convince his countrymen that a passage existed in that quarter, managed to win to his views the Earl of Warwick and other influential people, who among them subscribed sufficient money to fit out a small expedition of 2 ships, the Gabriel and Michael. Great opposition was offered to his project by the Muscovy Company, who considered that it entrenched on their privileges, but under pressure from the Lord Treasurer, they granted a license permitting it to be proceeded with. Frobisher's 2 vessels left at Deptford in the Thames on June 7, 1576, though it happened to be a Friday. Nothing of note happened till July 11th, when land was seen in latitude 61 north, a high and ragged land which he judged Friesland, whereof some authors have made mention, but durst not approach the same by reason of the great store of ice that lay along the coast, and the great mists that troubled them not a little. It was undoubtedly the southern extremity of Greenland that they sighted. A storm soon broke upon the ships, and sank the Gabriel's pinnace with 4 men on board. This so frightened the crew of the Michael that they put the helm about for England, and reached home without mishap. During the storm an act of great gallantry was performed by Frobisher, which undoubtedly saved his vessel, and certainly earned the devotion of his men. Undeterred by the desertion of the Michael, the Captain General ran northwest. On July 29th, he reached a new land of marvelous great height, which they judged to be the land of Labrador. To a bold headland he gave the name of Cape Elizabeth, in honor of his queen. This may be identical with Cape Chudleigh. It is hard to follow his course immediately after this discovery, but he probably crossed the eastern end of Hudson Straits to Resolution Island, lying off the southeast corner of Baffin Land, and entered the opening of what is now known as Frobisher Bay. This he thought to be a strait. He sailed up it for about 180 miles, not far enough to reach its end and discover his mistake. On going ashore and ascending an eminence, they saw in the distance some small objects which at first were thought to be seals, and turned out to be small boats made of leather, i.e., Eskimo kayaks. The occupants tried to steal the ship's boat, but the captain was too quick for them. One of the salvages came aboard and received some trifling presents. A party of 5 sailors detached to row him ashore were captured by the Eskimo, or else deserted, it is not certain which, and could not be recovered. In revenge, Frobisher seized one of the savages, who is described as having straight black hair, little black eyes, and a generally Tartar cast of countenance. As he was now very short-handed, the captain gave up the quest for the present, and after an uneventful voyage reached England in October. His fancied discovery of a passage to Cathay brought him great credit, but it is doubtful whether the matter would have been followed up had not he brought back with him a lump of black stone, much like to a sea-coal in color, which by the weight seemed to be some metal or mineral, which had been picked up when he landed to take formal possession of Meta Incognita. This substance, probably iron ore, was tested in a very primitive fashion by various people, and pronounced to contain gold in considerable quantities. As a result of a general eagerness to participate in the fruits of this valuable find, money was forthcoming to equip a second expedition of 3 ships, which included, in addition to the Gabriel and Michael, a royal ship of nearly 200 tons, named the Aid. With these, Frobisher sailed from Blackwall on May 26, 1577. Their first touching point was the Orkney Islands, where, our gold finders found a mine of silver. The people of the islands were very timid and would not for a time come near the English. Eventually they conquered their fears and sold provisions to the sailors. Their standard of living seems to have been very low at that period. Their houses were but poor without and sluttish enough within, and old leather, ropes, and clothes were by them valued more highly than the precious metals. After passing the south of Greenland again, they came to Frobisher Bay in July. As gold was the object of the expedition, more attention was given to prospecting than to exploration, so that the straits were not entered to even as great a distance as on the previous voyage. Curiously enough, at the spot where the first piece of ore had been picked up, they could not get a piece so big as a walnut, so that it may seem a great miracle of God, that being the only one rich stone in all the island. Plenty of ore was discovered in neighboring districts, however, and after much toil, 200 tons were placed on board the Aid. During one of the many skirmishes with the natives, they captured an old woman and a young woman with a child. The former was of such an ugly countenance that the sailors suspected her of witchcraft, and ungallantly pulled off her leggings to see whether she had cloven feet. As she had not, they released her. The other woman was retained as a prisoner to be a companion to a male Eskimo already taken. Her child having been slightly injured in the arm by a bullet, they put poultices on the wound, but she, not acquainted with such kind of surgery, plucked those salves away, and by continual licking with her own tongue, not much unlike our dogs, healed up the child's arm. The poor creature was subsequently released. The simplicity of the sailors in their test for a witch was quite as great as that of the Eskimo man, to whom they showed a picture of the prisoner taken on the previous expedition. He was upon the suddenly, much amazed thereat, and beholding the same with silence a good while, as though he would strain courtesy whether should begin the speech, for he thought him no doubt a lively, living creature, at length began to question him, and finding him dumb and mute, seemed to suspect him as one disdainful, and would with a little help have grown into choler, anger, at the matter, until at last by feeling and handling he found him but a deceiving picture, and then with great noise and cries ceased not wondering, thinking that we could make men live or die at our pleasure. The Eskimo were so hostile that Frobisher had to exercise the greatest caution to prevent his men being cut off whenever they landed. In fact, the Eskimo were to him what the bears had been to Barent's men, a source of constant anxiety. By wiles, some transparently simple, they endeavored to lure the English ashore, and when these failed, followed the boats along the ice, shooting numbers of arrows. From signs found in various places, Frobisher had reason to conclude that the men lost in 1576 had come to an untimely end. When August arrived, and with it signs of winter, the ships turned homewards again. To people interested in the subject of dreams coming true, the following incident may be worthy of notice. On August 29th, the master of the Gabriel told his captain that he dreamed that he fell overboard, and that the boatswain tried to save him, but was obliged to let go, so that he was drowned. The next day, both he and the boatswain actually were swept overboard by a wave. The boatswain managed with one hand to catch hold of a rope hanging from the ship's side, and to seize the master with the other. But being numbed by the cold, he at last let go of his comrade, who suffered the fate foreshadowed in his dream. The ships were scattered by a storm on September 1st and reached England at different ports towards the end of the month. There are in existence the reports of experts on the ore, showing the existence of a considerable proportion of gold and silver. The Queen thereupon took a personal interest in the dispatch of a third expedition to procure more ore, as well as to colonize the newly discovered territory. A fleet of 15 sail was collected, 3 to colonize Meta Incognita and remain there at least a year, the other 12 to explore. The admiral, Frobisher, and his 14 captains, after a gracious farewell from Elizabeth, started for the northwest in May 1578. Among the orders issued to the fleet were the following: that swearing and gambling should be eschewed, that divine service should be held twice daily, that at night the watchword should be "before the world was God," and the password "after God came Christ, his Son," that during fog trumpets and drums should be sounded continuously. The weather encountered off the coast of Baffinland was of the worst. For 6 weeks, from the beginning of July till the middle of August, the ships had to struggle with floes and icebergs, which thousands of times brought them within an inch of destruction. To use the language of one narrative, the floes open and shut together in such sort were the tides and seagate, that whilst one ship followeth the other with full sails, the ice which was open unto the foremost will join and close together before the latter can come to follow the first, whereby many times our ships were brought into great danger, as being not able so suddenly to take in our sails, or stay the swift way of our ships. Disaster soon overtook the Dennis, which struck an iceberg and quickly sank, though not before her crew had been rescued by boats from the other vessels. Then came a terrible storm. The ships that were entrapped among the floes were in constant danger of being squeezed flat or battered to pieces. To break the force of impact, the men hung ropes, beds, masts, and planks over the side to act as buffers. So great was the force of collision that balks of timber 3 inches thick were shivered between the ships and the floes. All hands realized the danger and worked with a will. As in greatest distress, men of best value are best to be discerned, so it is greatly worthy of commendation, and noting with what invincible mind every captain encouraged his company, and with what incredible labor the painful mariners and poor miners, unacquainted with such extremities, to the everlasting renown of our nation, did overcome the brunt of so great and extreme dangers. For some, even without board upon the ice, and some within board, upon the side of their ships, having poles, pikes, pieces of timber, and oars in their hands, stood almost day and night, without any rest, bearing off the force, and breaking the sway of the ice, with such incredible pain and peril that it was wonderful to behold, which otherwise, no doubt, had stricken quite through and through the sides of their ships. The pressure of the ice was so great that some of the ships were raised a foot above their ordinary floating level. After a day of struggle, 4 of the ships managed to get into clear water. The crews, kneeling devoutly round the mainmast, returned thanks to God for their deliverance, and prayed for the safety of the other vessels. As if in answer, the wind veered to west-northwest, dispersing the ice and liberating the imprisoned ships. In view of the approach of winter, as soon as cargoes of ore had been taken aboard, the vessels weighed for England, and arrived in harbor without further mishap. This voyage had added practically nothing to the knowledge already gleaned about the country bordering Frobisher Bay. John Davis. 7 years after the third venture of Frobisher, a West Country sailor, John Davis, who was accounted one of the most skillful navigators of his time, led out the first of 3 expeditions into the frozen north. From his friend and neighbor, Humphrey Gilbert, he had imbibed the idea that America was an island and could be passed on its Arctic coasts, and from Sir Walter Raleigh, Master William Sanderson, a London merchant prince, and a number of Devonshire friends, he received the pecuniary assistance which enabled him to fit out 2 small vessels, the Sunshine, 50 tons, and the Moonshine, 35 tons, for his first voyage in 1585. Davis's character, gentle, courteous, and God-fearing, attracted to him sailors of a good class, many of them Devonshire men, so that he sailed under the best of auspices. On July 19th, the ships reached the eastern coast of Greenland, which loomed suddenly out of a fog. So forbidding was the aspect of the great cliffs towering above the little vessels that Davis named the place Cape Desolation. Steering southwest, he rounded Cape Farewell, and turned northwest to a point where the old Viking settlement of Cathay once stood, which he rechristened Gilbert Sound after his friend Adrian Gilbert. The Englishmen were as much attracted by the verdure of the place as the Norsemen had been 6 centuries before. Good relations were established with the natives, so that the mariners felt some regret in leaving the fjord. Taking a northwesterly course across the straits which now bear his name, Davis struck Baffin Island in latitude 66 degrees 40 north on August 6th and anchored under a lofty cliff henceforth known as Mount Raleigh. Here the explorers killed their first polar bear. A run along the southeastern end of the great island brought the vessels past the Cape of God's Mercy into a large opening, Cumberland Bay. They then separated, and each explored one shore for a considerable distance without sighting the end, so that Davis thought it to be a strait. As provisions were now beginning to fail, a return to England became imperative. Next year, 1586, a second expedition of 4 ships was entrusted to Davis. It sailed from Dartmouth, May 7th. Near the Greenland coast, Davis dispatched a second-in-command with 2 vessels to explore the east coast of Greenland and discover whether it were an island, while he, with a mermaid and the Moonshine, headed for Gilbert Sound. The natives of the place, recognizing them as old friends, welcomed them with great joy. Here Davis had a small pinnace that had been shipped in pieces on the Mermaid put together, while he surveyed the surrounding country. To help pass the time, some athletic sports were organized, in which the little Eskimo proved themselves the equals of the sturdy sailors in wrestling, but their inferiors in jumping and climbing. The pinnace was launched on July 4th. In it, Davis made several expeditions up the fjords. On one occasion, he espied a very strange sight, especially to me that they never before saw the like, which was a mighty whirlwind, taking up the water in very great quantity, furiously mounting it into the air, which whirlwind was not for a puff or blast, but continual, for the space of 3 hours, with very little intermission. Equally interesting was the discovery on an island of a grave with a cross laid upon it, possibly a relic of the old Norse colonies. After a stay of a month, during which the Eskimo proved themselves very troublesome thieves, Davis left Gilbert Sound for exploration up the west coast. A few days later, the ships fell in with an iceberg of such enormous size that the commander refuses to give figures lest he should be disbelieved. It had bays and capes, mountains and lofty plateaux, and chilled the air in its neighborhood so much that the rigging was soon frozen stiff, and the men began to suffer from the cold. Yet this vast mass of ice was but a comparatively tiny chip of the colossal glacier which covers practically the whole of Greenland. In latitude 66 degrees 30, Davis found a good anchorage, where he revictualled the Moonshine and decided that the Mermaid should return home. Further progress northward being prevented by ice, he steered west across the straits to the Labrador coast. Down this he coasted to a district where game and fish, especially cod, were very plentiful, and crossing the Straits of Belle Isle, landed somewhere on Newfoundland. The Indians of the neighborhood attacked his men and killed 2 with their arrows before succor could be sent to them. Davis then headed for England, which he reached almost simultaneously with one of the vessels of Captain Pope's command. The other had been lost. This sub-expedition had been prevented by ice from effecting any useful exploration. As Davis brought home only a few furs and a number of salted codfish, his second voyage was regarded as a failure by all but a few people. Fortunately, the few included Mr. William Sanderson, who financed a third expedition. 3 vessels were prepared, the Elizabeth for exploration, the Sunshine, and a little clinker-built pinnace of 20 tons, the Ellen, for the cod fishery, which was expected to pay expenses. On May 19, 1587, the 3 vessels were at the now familiar anchorage of Gilbert Sound, where a pinnace that had been brought out in frame was put together. When it was ready for launching, the Eskimo tore off the two top strakes, or boards, for the sake of the nails they contained. A small cannon was leveled at them as they sheltered behind the boat and fired, but the gunner not having shotted the cannon in order to save the boat, the savages got off with nothing worse than a bad fright. John Davis now showed his character in a very remarkable way. It was necessary to catch enough fish to reimburse his good friend Sanderson. It was also incumbent on him to explore for a Northwest Passage. He therefore made a decision little short of heroic. Exchanging from the Sunshine to the little leaky Ellen, he dispatched the former and the Elizabeth to the fishing grounds of Labrador, while he proceeded up the west coast of Greenland. By June 30th, he reached a huge granite promontory, rising 850 feet sheer from the water, the nesting place of innumerable seabirds, to which he gave the name of Sanderson His Hope, because he thought that in this direction lay the best hope of a Northwest Passage. Further progress in this direction was unfortunately prevented by a severe gale which carried him on to the Labrador coast. He took advantage of the occasion to explore the Cumberland Strait more thoroughly, and found it to be but an inlet. He also examined Frobisher Bay and Meta Incognita, accurately laying down the southwest coastline of Baffinland. Next came the discovery of the Hudson Strait, through which the currents ran so strongly that it afterwards received the name of the Furious Overfall. Davis writes of it in his log. We fell into a mighty race, where to our great admiration we saw the sea falling down into the Gulf with a mighty overfall, and roaring, and with diverse circular motions like whirlpools, in such sort as forcible streams pass through the arches of bridges. Crossing the strait, Davis coasted Labrador to Daisy Island, where he had hoped to find the other two vessels. As they did not appear, having already sailed homewards, he made for Dartmouth, and arrived there September 15th, 1587. Of Davis, it may be said that he was the first scientific sailor to enter the North American waters. The Norsemen, Cabot and Frobisher, had been there before him, but it was he who mapped the shores of South Greenland, southeast Baffin Land, and Labrador, so preparing the way for Hudson, Baffin, Bylot, and the other intrepid navigators whose names are sprinkled over the huge archipelago between Canada and the Arctic regions. End of chapter 20. Chapter 21 of the Romance of Early Exploration. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Ted Leinhardt. The Romance of Early Exploration by Archibald Williams. The Adventures of an English Sailor in Africa. In the early years of the 17th century, a certain Samuel Purchas was vicar of Eastwood, a little village in the south of Essex, just 2 miles from Leigh. At that time, Leigh was a Thames port of considerable standing, since it provided pilots for vessels sailing up the river to London. Now it is completely eclipsed by its popular neighbor, Southend-on-Sea. About 1610 there returned to Leigh a sailor named Andrew Battelle, who brought with him a little Negro boy and a very interesting story of his adventures during an absence of 21 years. In 1625, the Reverend Samuel Purchas published his famous work entitled Purchas His Pilgrims, or Relation of the World in Sea Voyages and Land Travels by Englishmen and Others, which is one of our most valuable sources of information about the doings of early explorers. Among the narratives embodied in this work is that of Andrew Battelle, based upon papers left by the seamen and upon actual conversations between him and the editor. In spite of his humble birth, Battelle was a man gifted with a good memory and keen observation, which enabled him to give a fairly full account of the adventures in which, by the force of circumstances, He was involved among the savage tribes of the Congo district of West Africa. Quote, in the year 1589, Abraham Coke of Limehouse began his voyage towards the River of Plate, Rio de la Plata in South America, with 2 pinnaces of 50 tons apiece. The one was called the May Morning, the other the Dolphin. We sailed from the River Thames the 20th of April, and the 6th and 20th of the same month we put into Plymouth, where we took in some provisions for the voyage. The 7th of May we put to sea, and with foul weather were beaten back again into Plymouth, where we remained certain days, and then proceeded on our voyage. And running along the coast of Barbary, we put into the road of Santa Cruz, Tenerife, and there set our light horseman, a rowing boat, together which we carried in 2 pieces. Abraham Coke made great account hereof, thinking that the boat should have made his voyage. This done, we put to sea, and running along the coast of Guinea we were becalmed, because we were so near the coast. Here our men fell sick of the scurvy, in such sort that there were very few sound, and being within 3 or 4 degrees of the equatorial line, we fell with the Cape de las Palmas, where we had some refreshing, wherewith our men recovered. The people of the Cape de las Palmas made much of us, saying that they would trade with us, but it was but to betray us, for they are very treacherous, and were like to have taken our boat and hurt some of our men. From this cape we lay southwest off, but the current and the calms deceived us, so that we were driven down to the island of San Thome, thinking that we had been further off to the sea than we were. San Thome is an island in the Gulf of Guinea. And being in distress for wood and water, we went in on the south end between San Thome and the island das Rolas, where we rode very smooth, and with our light horsemen went on shore, thinking to have watered, but we found none in the island. Here we had great store of plantains and oranges. We found a village of Negroes, which are sent from San Thome, for the Portuguese, of San Thome do use, when their slaves be sick or weak, to send them thither to get their strength again. Having refreshed ourselves with the fruit of this island, we burned the village, and running on the east side of San Thome we came before the town. But we durst not come near, for the castle shot at us, which hath very good ordnance in it. Then we lay east and by north toward the main, and in 24 hours we had sight of the Cape de Lopo Gonzalves, Cape Lopez, and being within 3 leagues of the said cape, we cast about and stood again toward the island of San Thome, and turned up on the west side of the island. And coming to a little river, which runneth out of the mountains, we went on shore with our light horsemen, with 6 or 7 butts to fill with water. But the governor had ambushed 100 men of the island, and when we were on shore, they came upon us and killed one of our men and hurt another. Wherefore we retired to our boat and got aboard. Then Abraham Coke determined to fetch the coast of Brazil, and lay west-southwest into the sea, and being some 50 leagues off, we fell into a shoal of dolphins, which did greatly relieve us. They were caught and eaten, for they did follow our ship all the way, till we fell in with the land, which was some 30 days. And running along the coast of Brazil till we came to Ilha Grande, 60 miles north of Rio de Janeiro, which standeth in 5 degrees southward of the line, we put in betwixt the island and the main, and hailed our ships on shore, and washed them, and refreshed ourselves, and took in fresh water. In this island are no inhabitants, but it is very fruitful. And being here some 12 days, there came in a little pinnace, which was bound to the river of Plate, which came into water and to get some refreshments. And presently we went aboard, and took the Portuguese merchant out of the pinnace, which told Abraham Coke that within 2 months there should be 2 pinnaces come from the river of Plate, from the town of Buenos Aires. End quote. We were roaming ashore near the Rio de la Plata. Some Indians surprised and captured 5 men, including Batel. They were carried off to Rio, and 2, our author and 1 Torner, were sent by the Portuguese of that colony to St. Paul de Luanda, a town of Angola in West Africa, somewhat to the north of the mouth of the Kwanza. Since the middle of the century, the Portuguese had been busily engaged in exploring Angola and the neighboring northern district of the Congo in search of gold and slaves for their own markets and for the Spanish plantations in the West Indies. Dotted over the country were small forts, garrisoned by convicts and other Portuguese undesirables. To one of these, 130 miles up the Kwanza, Batel was sent to navigate the governor's pinnace downstream to St. Paul, quote, where I presently fell sick and lay 8 months in a poor estate, for they hated me because I was an Englishman, end quote. As soon as he was well again, the governor sent him in a small trading vessel to the Congo to collect ivory, elephant's teeth, he calls the tusks, wheat and oil, and subsequently to the province of Longo, with all commodities fit for that country, as long glass beads and round blue beads and seed beads and looking glasses, blue and red coarse cloth, and Irish rugs, which were very rare commodities. Here we sold our cloth at a very great rate, for we had for 1 yard of cloth 3 elephants' teeth that weighed 120 pounds, and we bought great store of palm cloth and elephants' tails, footnote. These were much valued by the natives. For 20,000 hairs, Batel purchased 30 slaves, end footnote. While cruising about on this business, Batel fell in with a Dutch vessel and arranged with the skipper to be carried away to Europe. But the Portuguese sailors betrayed him, and he was thrown into prison for 2 months, heavily laden with bars of iron. He was then banished inland to Fort Masangano on the Kwanza to take part in Portuguese punitive expeditions among the natives. After leading a wretched life for 6 years, he made a second dash for freedom. To continue his quaint narrative, quote, in this fort there were Egyptians, gypsies, and Moriscos, Moors, that were banished as myself. To one of these Egyptians I break my mind, and told him that it were better to venture our lives for our liberty than to live in that miserable place. This Egyptian was as willing as myself, and told me he would procure 10 of his consorts to go with us. So we got 3 Egyptians and 7 Portugals. That night we got the best canoe that we could find, and went down the river Kwanza, and being as far down as Mani Kabish, which is a little lord in the province of Alamba, we went on shore with our 12 muskets, powder, and shot. Here we sunk our canoe, because they should not know where we went on shore. As soon as it was night, we took our journey all that night and the next day, without any water at all. The second night we were not able to go, and were fain to dig and scrape up roots of trees, and suck them to maintain life, end quote. Presently they came to a river much infested by crocodiles, which they crossed at great risk to their limbs and lives. On the farther side, some Negroes met them and offered to lead them to the Congo. But instead of doing this, their guides took them southwards until the fugitives, suspecting treachery, refused to go any farther. A fight ensued in which 2 of the party were wounded, though all managed to escape. On the 7th day, a force of Portuguese and natives overtook and recaptured the runaways. Batel then paid a second visit to the prison at St. Paul, and this time had an iron collar added to the leg bolts. But he was too good a man to be kept idle. The Portuguese needed all possible help for a campaign of retaliation against certain tribes which had inflicted a severe defeat on them. The governor, Mendonça, sent Batel up country with 400 Portuguese exiles. During the fighting which followed, and spoilt many of our men, Batel received a wound sufficiently serious to necessitate his removal to St. Paul. Being naturally more of a sailor than a soldier, he was soon put to trading along the coast of Benguela, where 15 blue glass beads purchased a cow, so he tells us. On one of these trading expeditions, he joined a party of men ascending the Kuvu River. They fell in with a band of Jagas, predatory cannibals who roamed about among the less warlike African tribes, killing and spoiling. With these savages, they established a very lucrative trade and made several voyages between the Kuvu and St. Paul with the products of barter. When the Jagas went inland, the Portuguese merchants went after them. One of the chiefs through whose territory they passed begged them, or half compelled them, to stay with him and help him against his enemies, as the power of their firearms was such as no man could oppose. The traders gave the required assistance, and then asked to be allowed to depart. But Mofaragosat, as the chief was called, would not let them go until they had given him a hostage for a speedy return. The Portugals and mulattoes, being desirous to get away from this place, determined to draw lots who should stay, but many of them would not agree to it. At last they consented together that it was fitter to leave me, because I was an Englishman, than any of them. Here I was fain to stay perforce. So they left me a musket, powder, and shot, promising they would come again and bring 100 men to help him in his wars, for they feared that he would have taken them all captives. Here I remained with this lord till the 2 months were expired, and was hardly used, because the Portugals came not according to promise. The chief men of this town would have put me to death, and stripped me naked, and were ready to cut off my head. But the lord of the town commanded them to stay longer, thinking that the Portugals would come. And after that I was let loose again. I went from one town to another, shifting for myself within the liberties of the Lord. And being in fear of my life among them, I ran away, purposing to go to the camp of the Gagas." End quote. He fell in with the Jagas at a place called Casil or Casila, an important religious center on account of a big idol which stood in the middle of the town. The idol was 12 feet high and surrounded by offerings of ivory and the skulls of slaughtered enemies. During his travels among the Jagas, which lasted for 21 months, Batel became well acquainted with their organization and system of campaigning. It was their habit, when they came into a new country too strong to be overrun at once, to build a fort and let the natives waste a good deal of energy in useless attacks on it. As soon as the time for aggression came, the Jaga leader placed 1,000 men in ambush about a mile from the fort under cover of night, and in the morning paraded his men as if for a march. The inhabitants, approaching the fort to check this movement, were taken in the rear by the ambushed force and annihilated. His gun made Batel a very important person among the Jagas. When he went into a fight, a special bodyguard was told to look after him and carry him out of danger if he got into a tight corner. But he presently wearied of this importance and went back to St. Paul with some slave dealers in time to join a big punitive expedition led by Rodriguez Coutinho against a rebel chief on the Kwanza. Before the campaign was over, the Portuguese leader died. His successor gave Batel leave to return to his own country. Quote, "Then I purposed to have shipped myself for Spain and thence homewards. But the governor denied his word, and commanded me to provide myself within 2 days to go up to the conquest again. This governor had served his 3 years, and the citizens looked every day for another out of Portugal. So I determined to absent myself for 10 or 20 days till the other governor came, and to come to the city again. For every governor that cometh maketh proclamation for all men that be absent to come with free pardon. The same day at night I departed from the city with 2 Negro boys that I had, which carried my musket and 6 pounds of powder and 100 bullets, and that little provision of victuals that I could make. In the morning I was some 20 miles from the city, up along the river Bengo, and there I stayed certain days, and then passed Bengo and came to the river Dande, lying to the southward, purposing to know what news was in the city, for I was near the highway of Congo. And one of my Negroes inquired of those that passed, and brought me word that it was certain that the new governor came in that year. Now I was put to my shifts, whether I would go to the city again and be hanged, or to stay and live in the woods, for I had run away twice before. So I was forced to live in the woods, betwixt the rivers of Dande and Bengo. Then I went to Bengo again, to Moni Kaswe, and passed over the river and went to the lake of Kasanza. Here is the greatest store of wild beasts that is in any part of Angola. About this lake I stayed 6 months, and lived only upon dried flesh, as buffs, buffaloes, deers, roebucks, and other sorts, which I killed with my musket, and dried the flesh as the savages did, upon a hurdle, 3 feet from the ground, making underneath it a great fire, and laying upon the flesh green boughs, which keep the smoke and heat of the fire down and dry it. I made my fire with 2 little sticks, as the savages used to do. I had sometimes guinea wheat, maize, which my Negro boy would get of the inhabitants for pieces of dried flesh. This lake of Cassanza doth abound with fish of sundry sorts. Thus, after I had lived 6 months with the dried flesh and fish, and seeing no end of my misery, I wrought myself to get away. In this lake are many little islands that are full of trees, called memba, which are as light as cork and as soft. Of these trees I built a jurgado with a knife of the savages that I had, in the fashion of a box nailed with wooden pegs, and railed round about, because the sea should not wash me out. And with a blanket that I had, I made a sail, and prepared 3 oars to row withal. This lake of Cassanza is 8 miles over, and issueth into the river Bengo. So I entered into my jurgado and my 2 Negro boys, and rowed into the river Bengo, and so came down with the current 12 leagues to the bar. Here I was in great danger, because the sea was great, and being over the bar I rowed into the sea, and then sailed afore the wind along the coast, which I knew well, minding to go to the kingdom of Luanga, which is towards the north, and being that night at sea, the next day I saw a pinnace come before the wind, which came from the city, and was bound to San Tome, and she came near to me. The master was my great friend, for we had been mates together, and for pity's sake he took me in, and set me on shore in the port of Longo, where I remained 3 years, and was well beloved of the king, because I killed him deer and fowls with my musket." End quote. Here what may be called the action of Batel's narrative ceases abruptly. The rest of his book is taken up with descriptions of the fauna of West Africa and of the manners and customs of the natives. Some of these are very interesting, as, for instance, the rain-making of the king of Luanga. On a certain day appointed by the king, his people brought him presents and held a feast and sports. When these were over, the king took his bow and shot an arrow to the sky to bring down the rain. "I was once there," says Batel, quote, "when the king gave rain, and it chanced that day to rain mightily, which made the people have a great belief in their folly." End quote. As the king was not called upon till the rainy season was due, he ran little chance of failure. The natives would not permit any white man to be buried in their country, since they thought such a thing would offend their gods and keep the rain away. So the body of any Portuguese who died in Luanga was carried out to sea and thrown overboard. During his travels, the sailor came across the gorilla, of which he has some travelers' tales to tell, intermingled with a modicum of truth. Quote, "He differeth not from a man but in his legs, for they have no calf. They sleep in the trees and build shelters from the rain. They go many together and kill many Negroes that travel in the woods. Many times they fall upon the elephants, which come to feed where they be, and so beat them with their clubbed fists and pieces of wood that they will run roaring away from them. When they die, they cover the dead with heaps of boughs and wood, which is commonly found in the forests." End quote. Among the natives, ordeal by poison was widely practiced. A certain herb containing strychnine was shredded in the water, and the suspected person had to drink the liquor. If he fell down dead, he was accounted guilty, though the result depended more upon the strength of the decoction than on anything else, as Batel was careful to point out. We may conclude the chapter with a crocodile story. Quote, "One crocodile was so huge and greedy that he devoured a chained company of 8 or 9 slaves, but the indigestible iron paid him his wages and murdered the murderer, found afterwards in his belly." End quote. This yarn itself needs some swallowing. End of chapter 21. End of the Romance of Early Exploration by Archibald Williams.